to talk a little bit now about, we were just talking about holiness and how holiness passes from God to objects, how holiness passes to space and time, and how it also passes to people. And that one of the main purposes of the sanctuary is to make all things holy, which is to, to redeem the world as God's sanctuary is to make it holy. To redeem man as his image is to make man holy. And so the transmission of holiness is the main purpose of the sanctuary. Making objects holy is a fairly easy process. You can simply, God can touch an object and it becomes holy. Or people can dedicate objects to the sanctuary. We have many of these objects in the archaeological record. They have a little Hebrew inscription on them that says, "Holy to the Lord." And it's evident that these objects were dedicated to the sanctuary and just given to it as its property. However, making people holy is a lot harder than making objects holy because people have a will, or I use the word active. They do things. When they do things, they can either do them in accordance with God's will or in accordance with their will. And as long as they are doing things in accordance solely with their own willing and desiring, they're never really morally holy, even if they are ritually holy. So that opens up this problem. And so in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about sin and impurity. And the best way to define these are that these are the opposite of holiness. As holiness comes from God, so sin and impurity come from man. So sin and impurity have their origin in people, and they begin back with the fall of man and woman away from God. And like holiness, they too are catchy. You can transmit the quality of impurity to things by touching them or by actions that you do. And so that makes up for a lot of the rules in the sanctuary. Now, sin is a little bit different from impurity in that it is an act. Sin is a transient act. So transient means it happens and then it's over. So if I'm angry at you and I sock you in the mouth, then that's an act and it's over. However, there's something that's not over when the act is over, and that's your bloody lip, okay, after I just punched you in the mouth. So my sons do this. One son will deck the other one, and he'll get hurt. And then the one who did the deed says, "Well, I'm sorry." And then the one who's hurt says, "Well, what's that do for me? My leg still hurts." And so you have this whole bit about, sorry doesn't fix it, and back and forth it goes. Same thing here. Sin is an act. Impurity is a condition. That's the big thing to keep about those two things that are different. Sin is an act. When it's over, it's over. But it leaves a condition of impurity behind it. So even when the act is over, the condition of impurity still persists, needs to be dealt with. So, sin is an act of withdrawal from and rebellion against God. Once performed, it renders the whole person, I should say here, a sinner. Or I should say the whole person, I'll erase that. It renders the whole, once performed, the whole person is rendered ungodly. And the condition of godlessness means that the man's being is dead and his acts are futile at best and wicked at worst. Because man is separated from God, he is now dead as he was intended to be. Very important in the Genesis story of the tree in the garden. God says, on the day you eat of the fruit of the tree, you will die. Right? Only trouble is did Adam die on the day he ate the fruit of the tree? Oh, no. Well, he did and he didn't. He didn't die biologically. right? It wasn't like a poisoned fruit and, he died. He was biologically alive, but he died as the creature God intended him to be. On the day he ate of that tree, Adam was dead. Not biologically, he was still moving around and he had a forbidden fruit in his tummy being digested. But the creature God made was dead. Does that make sense? So you understand the significance of death. I think we all too easily read biological death into that passage when it's evident that on the day he ate of the fruit of the tree, he didn't biologically die. But what's important, what really died, was the creature God had created. That creature no longer existed, and it was dead from that point forward. And whether man died later on or not biologically is beside the point, because he was already dead anyways. So, very, very important. So, man's being is dead. And there I don't necessarily mean his biological being, I mean his spiritual being. He is spiritually dead. And the things that he does are therefore futile or wicked at worst. Futile means pointless. And at the worst, they're actually positively harmful. Now, impurity is this condition of godlessness. Like holiness, though, it can be passed to objects, people, and places. And so the opposite of sanctification is defilement. If God can make something holy and sanctify it, then I can defile something and make it impure. I have that ability to make things impure. And here again, just as there is ritual sanctification and moral sanctification, so there is ritual purity and moral impurity. And ritual impurity is generated passively through man's body in three ways. Each in three ways, signifying death, decay, or loss of vitality. And we'll give each of these. The three main causes of impurity, therefore, are corpses, the decay of the flesh, and the loss of vital blood or semen. Specifically, though, reproductive fluids. That's important. So we've seen these in the book of Leviticus, and they're often confusing to us because the moral laws make sense to us. Do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. All right, well, that makes sense. When Leviticus starts pulling this stuff, your average modern reader says, wait a second, this sounds really wacky. But once you understand that man is in a condition of death, God is the source of life, immortal life. In man's condition of death is signified through these three things. Corpses, obviously, are related to death. So you do not bring corpses into God's sanctuary because corpses are ritually impure. God is the source of life. You bring nothing into His sanctuary that has any association with death. My wife says to the kids, get those dirty shoes out of the kitchen, into the hall, and in the closet. You do not track mud into my house. Anybody have a mother ever say that to them? Okay. The kid says it's just mud. She says, fine, the mud belongs outside. It doesn't belong in the house. In the same way, these things are dirt that God does not allow to be tracked into His house. You're allowed to come into contact with these things outside. So if God was a daddy or a mommy, He would say, okay, that's fine, but you take those things outside. You don't bring them into my house. Why not? Because he is life, and these things are death. So corpses, if your flesh is but you don't have to just be dead. What if your body is in a state of decay? That too is not allowed, because decay is the opposite of all that God is. And finally, loss of vital blood or semen. Blood here doesn't mean any kind of blood. It has to be blood connected with reproduction. So if I get a cut and I'm bleeding, that doesn't cause impurity. It has specifically to do with reproduction and the reproductive fluids. Any fluid used in sexual intercourse that doesn't generate the production of a child decays and dies. And so the loss of those vital fluids is a source of ritual impurity. Now, I'll mention here, these do not convey moral guilt. That's very important. That's why the word ritual is here. So, if I come into contact with a corpse, or if my skin is decaying, or if I have lost vital fluids, I am not morally guilty. Okay? In other words, have you done anything wrong? You haven't done anything wrong, but you are ritually impure, and so you should not approach the sanctuary until you've been washed. So very, very important, because many times when people read these laws in Leviticus, they assume that they convey moral guilt. This doesn't make sense. How do you become morally guilty for touching a corpse?
So, do you think when these things happened and someone was rendered impure, was shame not really associated with being impure if it wasn't moral failure? Or was, if you get leprosy, do you carry shame still?
Do not convey moral guilt or shame. There are questions in the New Testament about lepers and whether or not they acquired their condition because of something that they did. But that in and of itself indicates that the leprosy itself was not the conveyor of the guilt. So those don't convey moral guilt or shame. They only require washing with water. Washing, waiting, and avoidance of the sanctuary. So for example, if I go hunting, I'm going to contact death when I hunt, right? Because I got to kill stuff. But I don't go on a nice hunting trip and then say, oh, I've got an hour left, I'm going to hit the sanctuary too. No, you're going to go home and wash, and you'll wait a day, you come to the sanctuary tomorrow. Or if I have sexual relations with my wife, I say, okay, that was great, time to go to the sanctuary. No, you're going to wash, you're going to wait, and you go to the sanctuary tomorrow. Or if I'm sick and I'm in a state of decay, the same thing. So it's very important that these things do not convey guilt or shame. There's nothing shameful about these, but they do signify death. And as such, they should not be tracked into God's house.
Can you explain how the loss of vital blood, like menstruation and after babies, is considered like a sign of death? Because I would see it as she can create life, that's why she's got the menstruation.
Good.
And then she just created life, that's why she has the postpartum bleeding.
The baby itself is life.
Yeah.
Okay? It's the vital fluids that are lost in the process, which decay and die, that are the source of death. So that's a good question, because you're right. In sexual intercourse or reproduction or giving birth, the most natural thought is, well, this is life. This is not death, which is true. However, in ordinary human sexuality, most actually of the vital fluids are lost in the process. So that's a good question. And actually, these things will become very, very important because they're all signs of our mortality, right? Symbols of mortality, that we are mortal creatures. And mortality prevents us from getting very close to God. God is the source of life. We are mortal creatures. We can't really get too close to Him unless our mortal condition is provided for. Three very important things Jesus does in the New Testament. He raises the dead. He also has a particular thing for healing lepers. And do we know the story of the woman who was bleeding for 12 years? Those miracle stories have been specifically selected because they arise out of the Levitical code. We generally read those stories as Jesus did a wonderful thing by healing so-and-so. But he did something more than just heal them. He enabled them to come to the sanctuary. Right? So when you read these miracle stories, there's more going on than just the personal health or of the person involved. These issues kept people away from God because they couldn't come to the sanctuary. And actually, when Jesus heals those people, he always tells them to do the same thing. Go to the priest. He says, go show yourself to the priest as a testimony to them. And what's really important about these things is that Jesus' resurrection from the dead is largely connected with the fact that Christians do not observe these anymore. Because Christians are no longer under the power of death. We are still mortal. Our bodies decay, we will die, we still lose vital fluids, but the point of the resurrection is that people are no longer under the condemnation of their mortality. And so because of that, they can enter into God's presence. They are pure. They are pure. Now, this is an issue we don't think much about, but for the ancient person, this was a big issue. Usually, when we think about coming to God, we think about moral issues. I can't approach God because I'm morally not where I ought to be. That's true. But for the ancient person, there was a second punch. There's more to it than just that. Even if you were morally perfect, you still couldn't approach God because you are mortal and because you are subject to death and because God is the source of life. You still cannot approach Him. So this is a very important issue. And let me see if there's any questions about ritual impurity, because this is foreign to modern readers and they don't understand it when they read the Old Testament.
Is there a synonym you could use for ritual, like sanctification and impurity?
In English?
Yeah, like, I'm just trying to wrap my mind.
I got some Hebrew words. Ritual sanctification probably would be the word election. And modern theologians like to use the word election when they talk about being chosen by God or belonging or adoption. So if I wanted to express to a normal person what I mean when I say I'm ritually holy, is that the word you said, holy?
Yeah, sure.
I would say, God has chosen me. He has chosen me to be His son. He's adopted me to be His son. I belong to Him. He's my father, I'm His son. Now they'll say, well, does that mean you're a good little boy all the time? Not always. So I'm not what I ought to be. I'm not the kind of son that I wish that I was. So maybe the language of sonship would help, because the language of sonship talks, a son in a certain sense belongs to his father, but he's still, or a daughter for that matter, she or he, they still have a responsibility to be a good son and daughter and to be obedient to their parents. That might be a way of talking about, these ideas can become complicated. Can we talk about them simply?
And I'm hearing you talk about the issue of justification and sanctification. So we're fully justified and our sanctification is the process. So when you're talking about ritual versus moral, I was thinking of like justification.
I think they're very, very close, yeah. So, I mean, if you're familiar with sort of Protestant ways of thinking about theology, those words arise out of things going on way back in the Old Testament. So those are probably close equivalents. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts about these issues? Yes.
So what would be, I guess, the New Testament version, or whatever you call it, the redemption of like the foods, like how you weren't able to eat any blood when it was like on the meat, or like you weren't able to eat pork.
There's different reasons. The reason why you cannot eat blood is not because it's impure. It's because blood is used to atone for sin. So there's basically two parts to the animal. There's the flesh and the blood. God says, okay, you can eat the flesh, but you cannot eat the blood. The blood belongs to God because the blood signifies the life. God is the sole proprietor of life. So you don't eat it. So it's not because it's impure, it's actually because it's holy. So there's rules in the Old Testament of things you can and can't do. Sometimes you shouldn't do it because it's impure. Sometimes you shouldn't do it because it's holy. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What?
Now that doesn't cover all of the food laws. I'll do the best I can here in a bit. But
How does God redeem that? I guess I want to say.
how does he change that?
Yeah.
Well, actually, the prohibition against eating blood still stands in the New Testament. If you read James' letter to the early churches, they're addressing your question, how many of these laws are we going to require of the Gentile nations? And one of the ones that James hangs on to is they should refrain from blood. Now, does that mean you cannot eat a rare steak? No, not necessarily. In fact, it's impossible to fully drain meat of blood, because it'll just turn to dust. So it's a question of how much. The purpose of the law is that you should not specifically go out of your way to drink or consume blood, which nobody in the modern world wants to anyways, for the most part. But in antiquity, this was a highly symbolic act of absorbing the life of the animal. Particularly in other ancient cults, they, in a very high-handed way, thought of themselves as proprietors over the life of the animal. And God wants his people to understand that life is sacred. He is the one who is the proprietor of life. We eat flesh only through his provision and permission, not because we have the right to reach out and take it. And as a result, we don't consume blood for that matter either. It's an unusual thought, but James in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, still upholds that particular rule. I don't have chapter verse off the top of my head, but Acts chapter 15. I bet that's it. Woo! Right.
Go, Chad.
All right, I'm going to erase this in a little bit. Now, while I'm talking about that, I want to move on to moral impurity. Any other questions in the back?
Yeah. Was it a big deal for a priest to be unclean?
Well, it's more of a big deal for a priest because since he has to work in the sanctuary, he can't work. If I'm just a hunter, it's not a big deal for me to become unclean unless I want to go to the sanctuary. But if I'm a priest, that means I'm out of commission. I can't do my duty. So priests have to be cautious of being unclean. There's a little bit of that comes through then in this parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament. The priests specifically avoid helping the man out because they're on the clock. They're going to the temple. If they help the Samaritan man out, what if he's dead? They'll become impure, and then they can't do their work in the temple. So there's actually good reason for them to walk on the other side of the road. But Jesus is pointing out that that's not as important as their obligation that they have to that individual. Now I want to do C2B. So I'm going to do C2B. And so hopefully, one other issue in terms of ritual impurity, we've seen that death is the basic rationale behind ritual impurity. When it comes to vegetable There is an avoidance of yeast or other agents or fermented drink. And a preference for salt. So if you're reading Leviticus very closely, you'll see that there's some particular rules that are connected with yeast, fermented products, and salt. Those are also part of this rationale. So I'll include those under the previous section. Yeast and fermentation are decay, as is mold. These are all sources of decay, so these are conveyors of ritual impurity. It doesn't mean that it's a sin to eat leavened bread or to have a drink or to have mold in your house, but what it does mean is that those things convey ritual impurity and they're to be kept out of the sanctuary. Does that make sense? Yes.
What during the Exodus? Why was yeast such a big deal?
Well, they were in a hurry, for one, so they didn't have time to let the bread rise. But in the Exodus event, every Israelite, the Israelites are, this is going to get a little goofy, but this is a picture of an altar here. When you're managing a sacrificial altar, you have to remove yeast from the altar, so get rid of the yeast. You have to have a fire and roast your lamb on it. And the blood of the animal is placed on the four horns of the altar. In the Passover, every Israelite household is treated as the equivalent of a sacrificial altar. The blood is placed on the doorposts. The yeast is removed from the house. The lamb is not allowed to be boiled. It has to be roasted. Okay. So every Israelite in Passover is placed on the sacrificial altar. In the ritual of Passover in the book of Exodus parallels the treatment of the altar with the house. So just as Abraham placed Isaac on the altar and he was spared, so that event that was so unique and special to Isaac, all of Israel is to experience that event in the Passover. Does that make sense? Okay. So when you look at the rituals, they have these little rules, like the lamb has to be roasted and put the blood on the doorposts and get the yeast out of the house. And you say, why? You know, what's that about? The more you learn about the sanctuary, the more the meanings of those rituals begins to come out of the woodwork and you can understand why they're there. So yeast has to be removed because it's an agent of decay. Blood is for protection. Flesh is for food. There it is. Good question. Other questions?
I got one.
Good.
What's the scripture about? A couple times it says you can't boil some kind of animal in its mother's milk.
That's a toughie. I don't know that I have a good answer to that. What I do think is, I think the phrase, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, is probably not a law. It's probably a proverb that is placed at the end of the law as a principle. And the principle at stake is about mixing life and death. Mixing life and death. At a religious festival, kids are, young kids or animals are more tasty to eat than older ones because the meat's more tender, you know, like veal. Okay. So when you're at a religious festival, you're going to boil the animal, and the most natural thing to boil it with is in milk. And the most natural milk to boil it in is the milk of the mother, which is right there and at hand. But the point is not to take something that was meant to nourish that young thing to life and use it as an agent of death. So I think that is probably a proverb with broad application. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk is a way of saying, keep this principle in mind. don't use agents of life as agents of death. We'll find various parts in the Bible where specific kind of weird situations come up for which there's no particular law, but in which it would be inhumane to do a certain act because of this basic principle. Yeah.
I heard it because there's a practice, I mean, just what I heard, but it's a practice done among a group of people and it was just like differentiating, like they may do that, maybe you don't do that.
A practice among the people who?
A practice among a group of people that they were living around or if they were next to people, like it's a differentiation, they may do that, but I'm asking you, therefore God is asking.
Yeah. That's a possibility. Whenever you have a law in Moses that you don't know what to do with, the fallback is the Canaanites must have did it, so don't you. And actually, in some cases, that's true. I think this particular passage is a proverb, though modern rabbis interpret it quite literally as a command not to mix meat and dairy. So if you're a Jew, one of the kosher laws taken from that verse is not to mix meat and dairy products together. So no cheeseburgers. You can have a burger, you can have cheese, you cannot have a cheeseburger. Isn't that sad? Now, before I get to B, I'm going to put B down here. 1, 2, it's got A, 3. That's all right. Before I get to B, a few things to remedy ritual impurity. The most basic is wash with water and wait. And depending on how long you have to wait will decide how serious the impurity is. Yes?
Usually goats, when they sacrifice their male, why does it say that there's one instance of
What's that?
sacrificing a female goat on one of the instances?
Why a female?
Yeah, instead of male. As per custom and stuff.
The gender of the animal, the age of the animal, and other things pertaining to the animal will change depending on the sacrifice. If the sacrifice is a female, then it's less valuable. If the sacrifice is a male, then it is more valuable. Male animals in an agricultural society are more valuable than females because they can be put out to stud and reproduce lots of other animals, whereas a female can only reproduce one at a time. So one of the issues you'll find in some sacrifices, a male versus a female. Some will specify that it be this old. If it's younger, it's more valuable too, because if it's older, then you've already gotten a lot of use out of it. So if I got my old cow that's, I've had for 10 years, and I'm like, well, I don't have much use for it, time to sacrifice. The Bible's going to say, no, that's not the idea, is not to give to Jehovah the junk that you don't want anyways. And so in order to understand those rules, know a little bit about ancient agricultural society, because they valued animals based on age, gender, size, and the value of the animal is very, very important. There's no coined money. Coined money hasn't been invented yet. So when you sacrifice an animal, you're liquidating your resources. It's a very expensive process, and it's very important that the Israelites take it seriously, that they only give to Jehovah things that are valuable. And don't give them blind animals, lame animals, animals that cannot reproduce. All of those are things that you're not supposed to do. So, remedying ritual impurity, the most basic is to wash with water and wait. And the length here depends on severity of the impurity. For corpse contamination, if you've come into contact with a corpse, there is an elaborate ritual in the book of Numbers for washing with this. And I will simply provide the chapter, and I will talk a little bit about it, but for the sake of time, I won't write anything down extensively because this could take up the whole board. But this ashes of the red heifer that are specified in the book of Numbers for washing if you've come into contact with a corpse. That's the law of the Nazarite. That is the law of the woman. I think it's chapter right after, it's later, right after the rebellion. Here we go. Chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15. No, that's not it. Up, 19, excuse me. Okay. Typically, I'll just say a few things about Numbers chapter 19. You may have already read it. There's an elaborate ritual in which the priest takes a reddish-colored heifer outside of the camp. He slaughters it. He throws some hyssop and yarn into the fire. He takes some of the blood and sprinkles it 7 times toward the sanctuary, which is way off in the distance. Then he takes the ashes and he puts them in a bottle. And then that bottle is used with water to purify people who have come into contact with a corpse. The main reason for that, I'll just say this, is the law of Moses stipulates that anybody who's come into contact with a corpse has to be sent outside of the camp because that impurity contaminates the sanctuary. However, if you sent families and individuals outside the camp every time they came into contact with a corpse, this is going to be logistically very difficult, and it's also going to be hard on people who are grieving for their lost loved ones. I know you're sad that you lost your dad, but you're also going to have to move, and we'll take care of you out there. So the purpose of this elaborate ritual is to perform the ceremony outside the camp in advance, to bottle it, and then you can actually purify people inside the camp. It's an ancient way of taking a requirement that needs to be done one way, bottling it so that that's done, and then you take it inside the camp. So if you're looking at Numbers chapter 19 and trying to figure out what is going on in this wacky ritual, it's an ancient way of bottling a ritual outside the camp and then taking it back inside the camp. That way when people have lost loved ones, they can still stay in their houses, they can still mourn for the dead, and they can still be purified. Finally, for skin decay, there is an elaborate ritual also in the book of Leviticus. And that is in a couple chapters, which again, I don't have time to go into great detail, but I do want to mention them. And those are in chapters 13 to 14. So these are the 3 ways of getting rid of ritual impurity. One ritual in Leviticus 13 to 14 for people who have skin decay. For corpse contamination, Numbers 19. All other instances of impurity, which are the vast majority of them, are very, very simple. Just wash with water, you wait a period of time, and then you can go in the sanctuary. Moral impurity. Moral impurity is not washed with water, but atoned for with blood. thus indicating that it conveys guilt and renders the life of the sinner forfeit. So just a note about moral impurity. There are two major agents of purification, water and blood. Water is used for ritual impurity, as we've seen, and so there's no moral guilt involved in those acts. They just need to be washed before you go to the sanctuary. However, if you do something immoral, then there is guilt involved, and you actually need to slaughter an animal and get blood for purification. The three major conveyors of moral impurity in the most serious ones in the law of Moses are idolatry, murder, and adultery. Idolatry, murder, and adultery, those are the most serious because they all warrant the death penalty. So these, if you're worshiping other deities, or if you are killing your neighbors, or if you are sleeping with your neighbor's wife or husband, then you're not going to say, sorry, I'll have to bring an animal. They're going to stone you, and that will be that. So other sins, lesser sins, will be atoned for in the sanctuary, but these ones receive the death penalty. There's a few others, but those are the most serious ones. Yes? But they did kill a lot of the people directly responsible in that particular event. So that's a good example. A lot of people died in the golden calf incident. But these things weren't the death penalty. Just a quick note, the Hebrew word here for adultery, this is sometimes used as a synonym for sexual sins of any kind. That's not the case. Adultery means sexual relations with a married person. That's what gets the death penalty. So the issue here is primarily that the individual is married and belongs to someone else, and you are transgressing those boundaries of marriage. If, for example, you are unmarried and you have sexual relations, you're guilty of fornication, which is not the same thing as adultery. And if you've read Exodus, when we get to the law, fornication does not get the death penalty. You're going to pay a fine, and you'll have to marry the girl unless the father says no way. So the father still gets a final say, and he says, I don't want you as a son-in-law, then you're out. However, that doesn't get the death penalty, and prostitution does not either. So these are the three main sexual sins in Israel, but this one is the most serious, stoning for adultery. So these are the main conveyors of moral impurity. Moral impurity does two things. It renders the life of the sinner forfeit, but it also defiles the sanctuary. So I'll write that. Now my notes on this particular board aren't very tidy, so I apologize for that. But what that means is when you sin, you have two things you have to take care of. One, you need blood to atone for your life, because your life is forfeit. But two, the impurity from what you've done has now defiled this sanctuary, and so the blood of the animal has to be brought into the sanctuary and wiped on whatever part of the sanctuary has been defiled. In the outer court, it is the gold altar or the bronze altar that is defiled. The holy place, it's the gold altar. In the most holy place, for the most serious sins, the Ark of the Covenant itself has been defiled. So one of the issues with the sanctuary is that the Israelites have a new communal understanding of sin. Abraham, if he sinned, all he's got to worry about is his relationship with God. However, now in the nation of Israel, every time someone sins, there are social implications because their sin defiles the sanctuary where God dwells. And if that sanctuary is allowed to accumulate enough impurity, God will then have to leave the sanctuary, and that affects the whole nation. So one of the things about the sanctuary is now the sins of the Israelites are no longer just between them and God. Everybody's affected. That sanctuary has to be kept pure because if God leaves, then they're like every other nation under the earth. They're just a people with a building and a government, but no God. So very, very important. And I'll talk more about that here in a bit when I get to the sacrifices, which actually I will want to do next. You can take a photograph of this. There is a very brief passage in Leviticus chapter 11 that makes reference to living water. Washing with water here. Living water just means moving water. Living water is preferable to still water or water in a well. And so you're going to get a preference in ancient Israel for bathing in rivers and things where the water keeps moving because it washes the impurity and carries it downstream. Okay, let me erase this, and I want to talk a little bit about the sacrificial system. Maybe I can get through the whole thing. Oh, was there a question? Okay, let's do sacrifice. I think this is D. Okay, the sacrificial system. Sacrifice is used to establish, maintain, and repair the relationship between God and Israel. So, first thing, what does sacrifice do? There are three things that it does. It is to establish, maintain, and repair the relationship between God and Israel, or Yahweh and Israel. So remember those three functions. Establish, maintain, and repair. Think of it like a marriage. If I get married, that establishes the relationship. Are there times where we need to repair the relationship? Every husband and wife knows that there are. Are there times where we need to maintain the relationship? Yeah. I don't talk with my wife only when we have a problem. That wouldn't be much of a relationship. Sometimes we talk because we're happy with each other. Same thing. Christians have the idea that sacrifice was just to pay for sin. But that creates a very dark impression of what this sanctuary is for. Most of the sacrifices were for food and celebration. And the blood was never used to atone for sin. So it's not like, well, the only time God and I communicate is when I've done something wrong. Most of the time, the sacrifices are for the sharing of food. So, quick examples here of establishing of covenant. When you're using a sacrifice to establish a covenant, the earliest examples are the Noahic sacrifice. We saw that when Noah came out of the ark, he performed a sacrifice. And at that time, God established a covenant with all of creation. And then there is the Mosaic one in the book of Exodus. That's at Mount Sinai, where Moses reads to the people the law and he sprinkles them with blood. You remember that scene? That's establishing the covenant. And then we have the ordination of Aaron, the ordination of the priesthood. And that occurs in the book of Leviticus. So all of those sacrifices are to establish a covenant. Then, as far as sacrifices to maintain covenant, we have a number of different types. We've got, they all go by the same name. The Hebrew is Zebah Shlamim, which means well-being, peace, or sometimes it's translated fellowship offering. So you'll have translations that say well-being, peace, or fellowship offering. That's a translation of that Hebrew word. I'll erase that. The primary purpose is to get flesh for food. The blood is simply poured out. So anytime you're reading in Leviticus or in the Bible about a well-being, a peace offering, or a fellowship offering, these offerings are not brought for sin. These offerings are brought in order to get food, in order to share in a meal, and in order to celebrate. They are holy, not most holy. So as we'll see, there's different grades of offering. Most holy are the most holy offerings. These are holy. As such, they are shared between the priest, the altar, and the layperson. So, in holy offerings, a little bit of the meat goes on the altar, a little bit of the meat goes to the priest, and then the layperson gets some of the meat. So it's distributed among all three people, and the altar is kind of like a table. And everybody gathers around the table and shares in a meal. Present at the meal through the altar is Jehovah. He's present at the meal. The priest is present at the meal, and the Israelite layperson is present at the meal. Usually he'll bring his family, and they can all sit around the sanctuary and have some food. There's three different kinds. There is the free will offering. There is a thanksgiving offering. And there is a votive offering. Free will offerings are brought for any reason that you feel like. If you're happy for any reason, you can come eat at the sanctuary. So, yes.
Did you say that those three are different types of the peace offering?
Yep. These are three different types of the peace offering.
Okay, thanks.
Free will offering is brought for any reason of joy. Thanksgiving offering is brought for good things received from God. So if you have the birth of a child, or a safe trip, or anything else that you are thankful for, that you understand is a gift from the Lord, you bring a thanksgiving offering and you celebrate. And a votive offering is brought for the completion of a vow. You made a vow to the Lord, and you kept your vow because you wanted to give Him something. So thanksgiving offerings are God giving you things and you're celebrating that. A votive offering is you wanted to give God something and you're celebrating that. A free will offering is you're just happy and so you want to eat. In any of those situations, these offerings are brought, particularly on these festal occasions, and there's a lot of eating that goes in the sanctuary. So it's a way of receiving food from the Lord and celebrating in His presence. So there's a lot of eating that goes on in the sanctuary. Sounds good. Now the next section I'm going to talk a little bit about the ones that repair. We talked about establishing covenant. I just briefly reminded us of the sacrifice with Noah, the one with Moses, the ordination of the priesthood. Once that relationship is established, it's maintained through continually sharing of food. And that's generally how families today continue to operate. My wife and I, we ought to do something together. 9 times out of 10, we're going to end up at a restaurant eating.
Yes.
Okay? When people want to maintain a relationship, they share food together. They eat together. And so that's a big part of what the sanctuary is for. Any questions about that?
It's awesome.
It's exciting. Now, we do need to repair the covenant. And this is the one that we're more familiar with because we particularly think of sacrifice as primarily in this third connection, though these are the earlier two. So this is the primary purpose. Actually, hold on. Pause. This is a good place for me to talk about the food laws. So before I talk about repairing the covenant, I'm going to mention Leviticus chapter 11, food laws. So here's the principle. The closer you get to Jehovah, the more exclusively you take your food from His table. So that's the general principle. If you understand that, then the food laws in the Old Testament begin to make sense. There are 3 diets. One for the priests, one for the Israelite, and one for the Gentile. And that's due to the fact that Gentiles are the furthest away from Jehovah. Israelites are closer. Priests are closest of all. They're in holy space, in holy time, all the time. And so, first of all, priests eat only sacrificial animals. Sacrificial meat. And that consists of 5 animals. Cattle, sheep, goat, pigeon, dove. So if I'm an ancient Israelite priest, I will only eat 5 different kinds of meat because those are the 5 kinds of meat that are allowed on this altar. And I don't get my meat from anywhere else except from that altar. If I'm an Israelite, Israelites eat sacrificial meat, so they get that too. And wild game, which are closely related to sacrificial animals. Gentiles eat whatever they want. They eat whatever. And again, while that sounds like a bonus, it's a sign of the remoteness that they are from the sanctuary. Because they are remote from the sanctuary and far from God, they get their food from creation, to be sure, but they don't get it from this sanctuary. Now, a little bit about, in order to understand how this works, we need to first figure out why these 5 animals. Why are these the 5 animals that are permitted on the altar and nowhere else? To say that an animal is pure, pure animals are animals that can be sacrificed. So that's the first thing. I'm going to erase this because I need more space, but I'll say that the main division of pure and impure is what animals can be sacrificed. So when God tells Noah, bring 2 of every impure animal on the ark and 7 of every pure animal, that's because the pure ones are going to get sacrificed. If you only brought 2 of every pure animal on the ark and then he killed one of them, well, there goes the species. So pure animals may be sacrificed. And so the question is, well, what determines what can be sacrificed and what can't be sacrificed? Here's what I'm going to say. I'll just remind myself I'm still on sanctuary here. Is all this temple worship stuff interesting to you? Yeah. This is pretty technical stuff. Okay, we have 5 animals. 5 pure animals. They are mentioned first in Genesis chapter 15. Interestingly, God says to Abraham, bring me 5 animals. And he mentions exactly these 5. Cattle, sheep, goat, pigeon, dove. Okay, these 5 animals have several things in common. You can put this in your notes somewhere. First of all, they are all domestic, not wild. So if we look at these 5 animals and say, well, what do they all have in common? Well, one, they're domestic. That means they're valuable and not dangerous. If you kill a deer and bring it to the sanctuary, you haven't really given God anything. Because that deer, I mean, you've caught it, it's not valuable to you the way a domestic animal would be. And it wouldn't be a good idea to bring a lion or a bear because you'll probably get killed. So there's some practical considerations here. These animals need to be domestic because they're valuable and because human beings and domestic animals live in cooperation with each other. Also, they are bred for meat, which is the purpose of the sacrificial system. They are not beasts of burden. One of the main reasons for doing sacrifice is not only to get blood, but to get flesh for food. And so it's important that the animals that are brought have the sort of flesh that people breed for the purposes of eating food. So you will not probably bring a horse to the sacrificial altar, or a camel, or a donkey, or some other animal that nobody in their right mind would want to eat unless they just had to. So these are going to be animals that are bred for flesh. And thirdly and finally, this is going to get a new vocab word for you here. They are not phonic. Yeah, exactly. This is a word not much used in the vocabulary. Chthonic creatures are those, those which live in, move along, or eat off the ground. And the reason is the dust which returns to the ground is associated with death. And is ritually impure. So, for example, you've got your basic land animals, of which there are 5. If you're going to eat a fish, fish are all wild. They have what's called farm-raised domestic fish these days, but that's like we're getting way ahead of ourselves. Not back at this time. Birds are not carnivores, and there's a list of them in the book of Leviticus. And all remish, which is the Hebrew word for chthonic, are prohibited. Usually the word remish is translated creeping things or swarming things. You'll have to look for it in your Bible. The word remish in Hebrew is not translatable. The closest word in English is chthonic, which doesn't mean anything to anybody. So most translators go with creeping things or swarming things. It would include things like snakes, lizards, pigs, no pork. But the point with all of these creatures, or bottom feeders if you're in the ocean. So if you're going to eat a wild fish, you have to have one with fins and scales because they're not bottom feeders. Crab and lobster and all of those wonderfully sweet, tasty things move along the bottom of the ocean floor, and they have a very strong association with death. Incidentally, the first chthonic creature mentioned in the Bible is, of course, the serpent in the book of Genesis. He will crawl on his belly and eat off the dust of the earth. Very close association with death as an impure creature. So this is the logic behind the food laws, what kind of flesh the Israelites are able to eat. They will eat. Priests will only eat these 5 animals. If I'm an average Israelite, I can eat those 5, but since I live away from the sanctuary, I get to hunt. What kind of creatures can I hunt? Only ones that are closely related to these. If it's a land animal, it has to have a split hoof, and it has to chew the cud, which is exactly what these 5 animals do. If it's a fish, it must have fins and scales so that it's not a bottom feeder. If it's a bird, it can't be on the list, all of which are carnivores, and none of these swarming things are allowed to be eaten. There are 3 insects that I can eat, which are locust, cricket, and grasshopper. And the reason why I'm allowed to eat those is because they have wings and jointed legs for hopping, and so they do not swarm along the ground the way most insects do. So I've hit that material real quick, but let me see if there's any questions, because the food law is one of the things that confuses people a lot.
It's kind of a silly question, but were the priests allowed to like season the meat when they sacrificed it, like salt?
Yeah, they could season it. Typically, you're going to season it with salt because salt is a preservative against decay, and decay is is a sign of, death. But salt is going to be your typical seasoning. Yeah, you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to make your food tasty.
Yes.
But the main issue, though, is to keep flesh that is associated with death away from the sanctuary, and to give people a narrower and narrower diet so that they are depending more and more and more. The priests draw their life almost wholly from this sanctuary. Yes?
So pigeons and doves are considered land animals, not birds? Is that
Pigeons and doves are birds. So these are land animals, and these are birds.
What are the other two 6 times 5 land animals?
Oh, if I'm an Israelite and I want to hunt, I can only hunt animals off land that have a split hoof or are ruminants, cud chewers, because they're closely related to those 3 animals. There's a wild sheep, wild goat, deer, buck, and do that.
Why is it those kind of animals and not other animals?
These specific animals and not other land animals is because of these 3 reasons. They have to be, maybe I've missed your question though. These are the animals that are fit for sacrifice, and then these are the special rules for wild animals for the average Israelite. So priests will only eat this. Average Israelites will eat this, but then if they want to hunt, there's a few special rules they got to follow to keep the wild game that they hunt very closely connected to these, which will keep them geographically connected to the sanctuary. They won't be able to leave very far. See, you got to understand, in ancient Israel, the idea of moving away, it's such a modern idea for us. I can live anywhere in the world. If you're an Israelite, you can't. You have to live near the sanctuary. Because if you move, how will you obey the laws of Moses? Right? If I'm in Australia and the law says visit Israel 3 times a year, how am I going to do that? So one thing is to realize that Israelite religion is inherently local. It has to take place in Israel around this sanctuary. Now that raises a problem, which will be good to close with. The prophets say God's going to bring all of the Gentiles in the world to worship Him at the sanctuary. How is that even possible? I mean, isn't the purpose of the sanctuary to reach everybody? But if the religion is local, it can't reach everybody. So that's one of the main issues in Jesus' ministry. How does Jesus manage to bring the sanctuary to people? He turns them into sanctuaries. So if by faith in Christ you can become the sanctuary, then you can worship Jehovah anywhere in the world. But you can't do that under the law of Moses. Was there a question in the back?
I was just going to say, God has to promise the redemption by redeeming the sanctuary of the world. He gives promise that the whole world is going to be a place of worship.
That's right. The way the prophets describe it, you might think that one day all of the Gentiles will come and worship at God's temple. What actually happens is God transforms people into His temple through Jesus, and the gospel spreads. And the Jews in the New Testament are very shocked because this is not how they expected it to work out. I mean, some of the Jews are, some of the Jews aren't. Paul's a Jew, Peter's a Jew, they're all Jews. But one of the issues is, how does God's religion move from being very local and limited in space and time to this temple? How does it sort of get wings and reach the far places of the earth? Is one of the great challenges that is raised in the law of Moses, and that isn't really addressed until the time of Jesus. But that's a big, big part of His ministry. Now, I'm out of time, and I'm moving quick. I hope I'm not doing too quick, but I got to go. So, thank you.